Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1984 science fiction classic, The Terminator. Now, The Terminator was co-written and directed by James Cameron. Now, before this, James Cameron directed a horror film called Piranha 2: The Spawning, and after this, he would go on to direct movies like Aliens and The Abyss and Titanic and Avatar. Now, the plot of The Terminator is, at a certain point in the future, an artificial intelligent missile defense computer system was created, and eventually this computer system became self-aware, and it saw all humans as a threat, so it started a nuclear war, and after the nuclear war, it sent out all these cyborgs called Terminators to exterminate all remaining humans. So a man named John Connor led a human resistance against the machines, and he essentially became the savior of mankind. So, the machines send a cyborg back in time to the year 1984 to kill the mother of John Connor, Sarah Connor. So a man named Kyle Reese is also sent back in time to protect Sarah, and that's the basic plotline of The Terminator. Now, The Terminator is a classic movie. It really is. Like, this is a great movie. It's a great science fiction movie, it's a great action movie, but it's also a really good horror film as well. Like, a lot of people don't really remember it for being a horror film, but it is kind of a horror film as well, or at least it has horror movie elements in it. Like, the Terminator in this movie is a legitimately scary character. He's scary because you realize that since he's a machine, he will never stop until Sarah Connor is dead. Like, he has no soul, he doesn't feel pity, so he will not stop until he's terminated Sarah Connor. And another thing that makes him a scary character is you realize that if he does succeed at killing Sarah Connor, it will essentially be the extinction of the human race, because Sarah would one day give birth to the savior of the human race. Now, in the film, the Terminator is of course played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he does a really good job in this movie. Like, the Terminator, once again, he is a legitimately scary villain, and this wasn't Arnold Schwarzenegger's first movie, but this is definitely the movie, or at least one of the movies, that really made Schwarzenegger into what he is now. Like, this was before Schwarzenegger would go on to be in movies like Commando and The Running Man and Predator. Now, in the movie, Sarah Connor is played by Linda Hamilton, who does a really good job in this movie as Sarah Connor. And Sarah Connor, she's a very likable character and a very sympathetic character. Like, this is a normal person who has been thrown into this almost impossible situation where she finds out that she's going to be the mother of the savior of the human race, and she's a very believable character too. Now, perhaps my favorite performance in this movie is Michael Biehn as Kyle Reese, and he does a really, really good job as the character of Kyle Reese in this movie. And I came across the review of this movie on YouTube, and the guys in the review said something that I actually really do agree with. Michael Biehn, he plays the character of Kyle Reese as somebody who's shell-shocked, and I really do agree with that. And you gotta figure, this is a guy who's lived all these years pretty much in a war zone. Like, he even mentions in the movie that he was born after the war, so he grew up in this post-apocalyptic world. He's spent all these years battling the machines, and he does come across as being somewhat unstable, which is kind of understandable given the environment that he grew up in, and also he traveled through time, which can't be a normal thing for a human to experience. Now, in the movie, the character of Kyle Reese has these flashbacks to his time, and technically they're not flashbacks since he's from the future. Technically they haven't happened yet, so they're more like flash forwards in a way, but in the movie you get these glimpses into his world, and one of my favorite scenes in this movie is a flashback or flash forward, whichever you like to call it, where you see Kyle Reese walking through this tunnel. I think it's supposed to be like an old sewer or something, and you see that people are living down there, and you really get a sense that this is the environment that people have to live in now since machines have inherited the Earth. And like he's passing all these people there, and you see like these little kids that appear to be watching TV, but the TV set is broken and it's just a fire going on in there, and you realize that they're just hurtling up to it to get warm, and you hear a woman crying in the background, and it's a really haunting scene, and you just see this horrible environment that these people have to live in. Now, one of the most effective things about this movie for me is how in the movie you do get a lot of flashbacks or flash forwards to this post-apocalyptic future, but the flash forwards are used very sparingly. Like, you find out a lot more about this world in which Kyle is from through his dialogue, and I love how in the movie you never see what John Connor actually looks like. They only talk about John Connor in the movie, so I really liked that aspect of the movie, and I just loved some of Kyle Reese's dialogue in this movie, how he describes this world in which he's from, and he really does make it sound like a really horrible place to live. Now, I believe the studio that put this movie out originally wanted O.J. Simpson to play the Terminator, but James Cameron was against this because he did not see O.J. Simpson as a ruthless killer. Kind of ironic now when you look back on it in retrospect. Now, before Arnold Schwarzenegger was cast to play the Terminator, I believe James Cameron originally wanted Lance Henriksen to play the Terminator, and there's actually a story that gets told on one of the special features on this DVD where Lance Henriksen actually dressed up like the Terminator and showed up to a meeting about this movie, and apparently it scared the shit out of everybody there, and I'm glad Arnold was the one who ended up playing the Terminator, but that would have been really interesting to see how Lance Henriksen would have played the Terminator. And Lance Henriksen does have a small role in this movie as a police sergeant. Now, before this movie, James Cameron actually worked for Roger Corman. Like, he worked on the Roger Corman-produced movie Galaxy of Terror, and I did notice kind of a Roger Corman influence in this movie. Like, the film has a relatively low budget, but you could tell that James Cameron definitely knew how to stretch a budget, which is probably something that he learned from working with Roger Corman. And also, in this movie, you have a brief cameo appearance from Dick Miller, who most people would know as Mr. Futterman from Gremlins, but Dick Miller was in a lot of Roger Corman movies like A Bucket of Blood and The Terror, and I almost feel like Dick Miller was put in this movie as almost like a little tribute to Roger Corman. Now, apparently this movie has very similar plot elements to a short story by Harlan Ellison called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and it also has very similar plot elements to 2 episodes of The Outer Limits, which were also written by Harlan Ellison. One episode called Soldier, and the other episode called Demon with a Glass Hand. Now, I've never seen those 2 Outer Limits episodes, and I never read the Harlan Ellison short stories, so I really can't comment on how similar this movie is to the stories by Harlan Ellison, but Harlan Ellison actually threatened to sue the studio that put this movie out if he didn't get some kind of screen credit in this movie. So at the end of this movie, you get a little credit saying acknowledgement of the works of Harlan Ellison, but apparently James Cameron did not want to put that there because Cameron claims that he did not get the idea for this movie from the stories by Harlan Ellison. Now, if it is true that he did get the idea for this movie from those stories by Harlan Ellison, and he just won't admit it, then that is kind of douchebaggish on his part. But at the same time, though, I have heard that Harlan Ellison is very litigious. But once again, I've never read the short story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and I never seen those 2 Outer Limits episodes, so I really can't comment on how similar this movie is to those stories. Now, when this film came out, it was a huge success, and now the film is credited as being one of the most revolutionary action films ever made, and the film went on to spawn a series of sequels. In 1991, you had Terminator 2: Judgment Day, which was also directed by James Cameron. In 2003, you had Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines. In 2009, you had Terminator Salvation, and just this year, 2015, you had the film Terminator Genisys, and also there was a TV series called Terminator: The Sarah Connor Chronicles, and besides that, there were also comic book spin-offs of the Terminator series as well. But yeah, The Terminator, it's a classic film, and if you haven't seen this movie yet, I highly recommend it, but then again, who hasn't seen The Terminator? It's like, I feel like this is one of those movies I think everybody has seen at least once in their life, but The Terminator, it's a great science fiction film, it's a great action film, and it's also a great horror film as well. So if you haven't seen this movie yet, I highly recommend it. So yeah, that's my review on The Terminator, and bye.